The King's private conversations with the US president are usually kept secret, but when the monarch arrives in Washington, D.C. today, we can imagine they might compare notes on one surprising trait they both share: absolute serenity in the face of extreme danger. 32 years ago, shots were fired by a protester as the then Prince Charles stood on stage in Sydney, Australia. The monarch gave a masterclass back then in the stiff upper lip, stopping briefly to adjust his cufflinks before laughing it off. President Trump, steely in his own unique way, was back at the podium joking and selling his new ballroom less than 2 hours after a gunman attacked the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
Nobody told me this was such a dangerous profession. If Marco would have told me, maybe I wouldn't have run. Maybe I would have said, I'll take a pass. No, it's a dangerous profession, but I don't view it that way. Look, I'm here to do a job.
Well, no matter your views on the US president, his ability to remain calm and even amused after what looks like a third attempt on his life is pretty remarkable. The problem is he shouldn't have been put in that position again. The Secret Service may have done a good job in safely shutting down the attack once it began, but the fact is the alleged gunman was able to breeze past security, arms to the teeth, and sprint toward a ballroom where everybody in the presidential line of succession pretty much was sitting. We then saw Vice President J.D. Vance and the president being bundled to safety before the whole of the cabinet and eventually the entire DC media was evacuated. Security has to be flawless for an event of this magnitude with zero exceptions. The gunman actually mocked the lax security in his twisted manifesto that he released a few minutes before the attack, writing, "This level of incompetence is insane," and pointing out that had he been an Iranian intent on doing something bad at that event, it could have been an awful lot worse. At best, this is embarrassing for the US. At worst, it's another catastrophic failure. And one of the reasons why so many lurched immediately to conspiracy theories is that so many questions remain unanswered about the previous attempts on Trump's life. There's a crisis of political violence in the United States. Nobody wants to find out what happens to that tinderbox if the next attack ends in disaster. Well, in a moment, we'll be debating this and the fallout with my panel. But first, Senior Advisor to the US Agency for Global Media, Kari Lake, joins me. Kari, welcome back to Uncensored. You were at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. When was the first you realized that something serious was happening?
Well, we had just finished our salads, and the staff at the Hilton started to bring around the table trays. And they were setting them up, you know, at each table. And we heard some loud noises. And I just assumed it was, you know, this room full of 2,500 people and a lot of wait staff dropping things or potentially the sound of dishes, et cetera. And I was sitting next to Chris Ruddy and he said, "Get down, that's gunshots." And I said, "What?" I looked at him like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Gunshots?" He said, "Yeah, that was gunfire." And we all just ducked down in our chairs. We didn't hit the floor. At first, I just didn't believe it because it's just such a surreal thing. You know, you're in a situation like that and it doesn't feel real. But I looked up, I popped my head up and looked around and I saw tons of security just popping up from individual tables, men with weapons and a lot of weaponry jumping up and then running toward members of the cabinet, obviously escorting the president off the stage, which we were happy that he got safely off the stage. So the Secret Service did do their job in getting all of the cabinet members and the vice president and the president off the stage. But the thing I noticed, Pierce, that was so shocking is upon entering the Hilton, they didn't even inspect our tickets. They just said, "Do you have a ticket?" I opened up my purse and the back of my ticket was showing, which was just a blank card. And that was good enough for them to nod me in. I never had to show my passport or identification. And right when you walked in the door was where the red carpet was. That's where members of the cabinet were doing interviews and on the red carpet. Literally anybody off the street could have probably walked in very easily and had access to some very important members of the administration.
Well, and in a way, even worse, this guy had got a train from California to Washington and then just calmly booked himself into one of the Hilton hotel rooms where nobody had checked the fact that he was armed to the teeth. He had 2 guns on him when he made his attack. He had knives on him and so on. And he was even able, in his twisted manifesto, as I referenced earlier, to openly taunt the Secret Service. So much as I would give credit to the Secret Service for what they did once he made the attack in stopping him reaching the ballroom, the reality is he should never have been able to get as far as he did in the first place, armed in the way that he was. And I just find it incredible that when you have a president as controversial as Donald Trump, and where it's obvious a lot of people hate him as much as like him, after 2 attempts on his life, one in Butler, Pennsylvania, where he got hit, and one on the golf course where I think it was miraculous that he didn't get killed that day either. The fact that this guy was able just to calmly book himself into a room on the Friday, the day before, and no one's checking that he is a potential attacker with loads of weapons, I find that just incredible.
Well, I mean, they needed to have better security getting into the ballroom. I mean, that metal detector was 1 floor up, but all that shooter had to do was run down a flight of stairs, and right at the bottom of the stairs are the doors that open up to the ballroom. I mean, it's astonishing and frightening how close he was able to get to a room full of people who are administration officials, including the most powerful person in the world, President Donald J. Trump. So many things went wrong. I don't know if it's the hotel's fault. I don't know how the security was handled. But I'm just telling you that I was able to get in. Nobody ever asked for an ID. No one ever inspected a ticket. There was 1 metal detector, and something's got to change. And thank God the president is safe. I, for one, and I feel like that can speak for the American people, I'm tired of the president being put in positions where people are trying to kill him. And I think that the media has to take some of the blame. 90% of the people in that ballroom, Pierce, are part of the mainstream media. And many of them despise the president and have pushed just hideous rhetoric over the past decade about President Trump. Remember, President Trump is a human being. He's a man that everybody loved before he got into politics. You mentioned he's controversial and that people hate him. Why do they hate him? It's because of a steady stream of negative lies that have been told about the president over the course of a decade by the majority, if not all, of the mainstream media. It's constant lies about this president. They have poisoned the minds of the American people and, frankly, people around the world. President Trump, when he was Donald Trump, entered into politics, a successful businessman, a beloved member of the American society. And the only reason people hate him, if they hate him now, it's because of the lies that the mainstream media has sown on this man. And they have to look in the mirror and they have to take responsibility for that. And I think we need to do a major overhaul of the media. There's a huge responsibility when you are speaking into a microphone, looking into a camera, to be honest. And they've stopped doing that. I walked away from my career after 30 years. I walked away from a 7-figure contract because I recognize, wow, they're forcing us to lie about things, lie about things like COVID, lie about vaccines. They're forcing us to lie, and I'm not going to lie to the people, to the viewers that watch me. And I think we need to do a massive overhaul of the media right now. Wash out some of these people who just cannot push their hatred of President Trump aside and be honest brokers.
What do you mean by wash out? What would you want to see happen?
Fire them. Move on. Thank you. We're happy. Thank you for your service. You have shown and proved you cannot be an unbiased journalist. Thank you for your service. We're moving on, and we're moving in a new direction. And you have to look beyond just the faces that you're seeing on television and the voices. You have to look at who's running the operation. When I worked in television, you got to look at the producers and the writers. We had a notorious producer at one of my previous jobs, radical leftist. And that's the person who's deciding what stories go into a newscast. That's the person who oftentimes is writing and setting up the entire decision-making process on what stories are going into the newscast. So we've got to make sure that we have diversity in thought, not 95% radical leftists in the newsroom, but people who have diversity when it comes to thoughts, ideas. Some of them have a conservative ideology. Some may have a more moderate ideology, and including some who maybe have a more liberal ideology. But we cannot continue to run newsrooms where 90 to 95% of the people in the newsroom are radical leftists.
The interesting part of what you're saying is you actually had a direct confrontation with CNN's Jake Tapper, I understand. You said, I walked out right next to Jake Tapper, this is at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and looked him in the eye and I said, how dare you? You've caused so much division in this country pushing lies. We're not going to call it gaslighting anymore. You've lied to the people. How dare you do that? Why did you single out Jake Tapper, and how did you respond to this?
Well, I wouldn't call it a confrontation. I mean, confrontation implies that you're, almost picking a fight with somebody. We're walking out together. Remember, there were a lot of well-known figures in that room. I happened to be sitting at a table next to CNN, and before dinner started, I actually went over and I said, you guys need to up your game because you have put out the most ridiculous news. You can't even call it news. When I go to these events, just because I'm rubbing elbows with people in the media and people that others know that are quote unquote famous, I don't have to lie and act like I like them. I think these people have acted in a despicable, unprofessional way. And when we were evacuating the building, I looked over and happened to see that I was right next to Jake Tapper. And as we were walking, I just said, you've been a derelict in your duties. You've lied to the people. How do you live with yourself? These people need to be called out. Why would I walk out with him?
But Kari, here's what I would say. Look, Jake's not here to defend himself. I'm sure he will on his own show. But they would argue, with some justification, that there's been a lot of lying going on from the political classes too. That they would say that President Trump is not always a guy who is 100% truthful in what he says. That many of the people that in his cabinet or his supporters often tell whoppers and lies to suit them, and that they are in a
policy, Pierce. You can argue with the policy. But the media has a duty to be fair, and the media is calling him
right. I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that. But do politicians have a duty to tell the truth? If you want that from the media, and I agree
Trump
with you,
been one of the most truthful politicians that we've ever
Well,
had.
hang on. Let me finish my point. I do think they've been biased collectively against Trump. There's no question of that. But I also think that it's incumbent on both sides, isn't it, to strive to always tell the truth. Would you agree with that?
The media has been they've failed so miserably in that. I mean, last night on 60 Minutes, Norah O'Connell, she starts reading from this violent, deranged lunatic's manifesto. She's reading the manifesto to the president, asking the president if he's a monster, if he's a pedophile.
Well, let's watch that clip,
That was one of the lowest forms of journalism I've ever seen. 60 Minutes is now a
let's watch that clip, because I have a view about that as well. Let's watch the clip.
So-called manifesto is a stunning thing to read, Mr. President. He appears to reference a motive in it. He writes this, quote, administration officials, they are targets. And he also wrote this: I am no longer willing to permit a pedophile, rapist, and traitor to coat my hands with his crimes. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I was waiting for you to read that because I knew you would, because you're horrible people, horrible people. Yeah, he did write that. I'm not a rapist. I didn't rape anybody.
Do you think he was referring to you?
Excuse me. I'm not a pedophile. You read that crap from some sick person.
Now, I thought that was incredibly disingenuous by Norah O'Donnell for two reasons. One, of course she was inferring that this had been said about President Trump. She knew that, he knew that, and it was just a ridiculous game she was playing to try and feign innocence. Oh, you think he was talking about you? But secondly, I was trying to think, if that had been Obama or Biden or any of the Democrat presidents in particular, would she have read out these incredibly defamatory comments? And the truth is, I don't think she would have done. So there is one rule for Trump in their eyes and one for everybody else. So on that, I'm with you completely.
They didn't even have access to Obama. Obama barely ever did an interview. with these people.
Right.
And when they did have a chance to ask him questions, and they asked questions of Joe Biden, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? I mean, this is, Pierce, there's no sugarcoating it. The mainstream media is completely shot. It's terrible. There's no recovering with these same cast of characters. They got to
Right, but you haven't actually answered. Okay, but Kari, you haven't actually answered my question, which is, does the same rule apply to the political class? Is it incumbent on you and President Trump and every member of the cabinet to also always tell the truth? You haven't answered
naturally,
that.
I think people, Pierce, of course, I think people should tell the truth, and I think the president does. But the media is covering the president. The media has never covered a president the way they covered President Trump. They have tried to destroy this man's reputation. He's an incredible human being. He's fighting for our country. He didn't need any of this. And they have covered him in a way that is so disrespectful and so hurtful to the American people. It's tearing apart the American people, the work that the media has done. And I'm not going to give them 1 inch here. These people, many of them, are absolutely despicable human beings for the way they've handled their profession. They've destroyed the profession of journalism. And hopefully we can move some of these folks out and bring a fresh crop in, because we need people who actually understand what fairness is. And I don't believe Nora O'Connell has the ability to be a fair human being after that interview.
What did you make of President Obama's post on X, which has been widely criticized, didn't mention Trump by name? And it started, although we don't yet have the details about the motives behind last night's shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, it's incumbent upon all of us to reject the idea that violence has any place in our democracy. It's also a sobering reminder of the courage and sacrifice that U.S. Secret Service agents show every day. I'm grateful to them and thankful that the agent who was shot is going to be okay. You know, again, noticeable that he didn't mention President Trump by name, and also that he claimed not to have any information about potential motive, when in fact, several hours before he posted that, we'd had all the contents of this twisted manifesto, which made it pretty clear what his motivation was.
Well, I'm not going to get into what, Obama was thinking. It's pretty sad that he couldn't, at least put a line in there that he's thankful that President Trump is safe. But I don't think he is. I think a lot of people in that room, sadly, it's a room full of, twisted so-called journalists who are radical. And I think some of them may have been rooting for the assailant in this case. That's how sick they are. And they have to take the blame for getting that guy in that guy's mind. I mean, the media has, when you're watching a steady stream of people calling the president the most heinous names ever, calling him a dictator, calling him a Hitler, when that is going on day after day after day after day, it's almost like an emotional, mental abuse that's inflicted on the American people. And some people who are weak-minded are going to succumb to that kind of rhetoric, and they're going to act out. And that's exactly what we saw transpire, both in the case at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and in the past with the other attempts on the president's life. I wish the media would take some responsibility for it and bring down the temperature about 1,000 degrees.
Kari Lake, thank you very much indeed for rejoining me on Uncensored. I appreciate it.
Thank you.